formula.
We've all.
My name is Derek Scissors. I'm a senior fellow here focusing on China and international finance. I am not the moderator, thankfully, because I'm not at all moderate. I am just here to be a transition point to Chris Miller, who will moderate. We have a full hour and a half, so I hope you guys have questions. If you have bad questions, I will tell you those are bad questions. So please have good questions. But we're going to start with the discussion as Chris wants. So Chris, over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Derek, for convening this event. In addition to Derek, who has enough opinions to fill up our entire 90 minutes all by himself, we've also got two other experts to join us. David Feith, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, and Aaron Jin, CEO of Hydra Host. Let me start, David, with you. Our topic today is looking at the trade-offs between national security when it comes to export controls and the interests of American businesses exporting abroad. How do you conceptualize these trade-offs? How real is the trade-off? When you were in government, how did you see this playing out?
Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks to Derek and AI for having us. I think the trade-offs question is valuable and important, and often, I think, misconstrued. There certainly are certain basic trade-offs between, say, the ability to access a market like China's market in revenue terms versus the US government's interest in limiting certain trade using export controls in a manner that obviously and definitionally would cost companies the revenues that they would otherwise be able to capture in China by those continued sales. But the formula for thinking through the policy considerations here, and even I think very often the commercial considerations, is much more complex than that. And I think the history is quite interesting and fairly clear. I think not only do we see a lot of evidence that we can, I assume, go into in the discussion of those export controls that we have on US exports to China working in ways that advance the national security objectives that motivated them, where you have, for example, commentary from major players in China's AI world, like the leader of the firm that has produced DeepSeek, saying that his main limiting factor in the development of their AI technology has been US export controls on advanced chips in recent years. You not only have that sort of evidence of the national security and strategic competition effectiveness of US controls, but you also have the record of, frankly, quite overstated warnings from certain parts of industry, US industry and allied and partner industry, that have made warnings about their future profitability, their future ability to invest in R&D, being fundamentally, sometimes existentially threatened by export controls that were under consideration in Washington. And the empirical record of these cases is that the placement of export controls that have been critiqued in that manner has not actually led to anything like these sometimes skyfall warnings about the revenue effects on affected US companies. And then, relatedly and really quite crucially, permissive controls, or the absence of controls, which is actually the main, history here, is that, the US-China trade and export relationship is overwhelmingly still not controlled, and in historical terms has been subject to partial controls only for a very small number of years. And the record, if you look at all sorts of sectors, including especially technology sectors, whether it's aspects of computing-related tech, or it's things like EV batteries, solar, various other critical industries over the past decades, when subject to no controls or to light controls, China's industrial policies in targeting these industries have proven quite effective, often much more effective than US government and corporate models assumed. And this has been to the detriment, sometimes catastrophically, of the interests of US competitors, including US competitors who got to go to China, enjoy those revenues, but see their access to the Chinese market often used against them very effectively and very subversively by Chinese partners and by the Chinese party state. And so in those cases, the perceived benefit of those continued revenues actually led often to extreme damage, sometimes catastrophic effects on the medium and long-term bottom line of interested US and allied companies. And I think that is a very important part of the multivariable equation. And I'll just leave it there for now.
Well, let me turn it to you, Aaron. You look at this from the perspective of someone in business, in computing, which is the segment that has faced the broadest expansion of controls over the past couple of years. How does it look from the perspective of someone in the corporate world, in the business world? Do you see things like David outlined them, or is your perspective different?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I've been back in this building since Arthur was here, so it's nice to see the building still looks the same, and has been very well kept. And so my background is in terms of DC, because of my first exposure. I was based in Silicon Valley, now I'm in Colorado. Has helped build the first digital service under Obama, and then subsequently after that started an organization called FAI, which I co-founded, which I'm no longer involved with. And then on Trump 45, helped on various different things of like pro-crypto regulation. Actually, you could say like one of the early China hawks in the Trump 45 as an outside advisor, doing everything from China buying land, okay, being opposed to that, to drone technology, things like that. And so what I do in terms of being a co-founder, being a tech entrepreneur, today, this is my fourth company, is we're essentially one of the default AI factory platforms globally. We're in over a dozen countries, about over like 55 data centers, manage probably close to 20,000 to 30,000 GPUs right now. So we deal with international customers, we deal with BIS, we deal with all sort of varying around these regulations. And so what we've seen is through both two different administrations is, I would say, like from on the ground, there's definitely, like I would agree with David, that there definitely is an impact, clearly, in terms of everything from the smuggling market to actually what's happening on the frontier lab side within China. But I think that where it struggles in terms of coming from the commercial side is like, what's the goal, right? And it constantly shifts. And you could loosely say that the current rescind rule that is, I don't know if it's officially out or not, but the rescinding of the Biden October rule, there was probably like a grab bag of like 8 to 5 different objectives in that, depending on like how you calculated that. For example, like why was Austria limited but Germany not, right? Why was Portugal on the naughty boy list? And then you talk to the people who actually helped, make the rule, like the Gulf region, right? So like Israel's also on the bad boy list. Like we sell them F-35s, we're not gonna sell them Hoppers. Like and you talk to them and it was actually like this kind of complex mix of things they were trying to accomplish. It wasn't just related to like, well, our goal is to prevent Chinese form ASI, AGI, or is to prevent them from having GPUs. It was like, no, they have cheap power. Or like, I don't really trust them. Or like, we heard that they're buying Huawei. And I think that's right from the commercial side perspective, it's like, what are you trying to do here? And when you target particular companies that, let's say, have no connection to it, right? Or maybe doing some part of the value chain of creation of AI, that's where you get something like super messy and like high conflict point. So I think like from, someone who actually operates in the space, there's a, not a carte blanche sort of do whatever you want sort of posture. I think from people in industry, there isn't this like a general perspective of like everyone should be freewheeling, doing whatever, like we're trading with the EU. I don't think that is the perspective. But I do think it's like having actual like a goal right now. And even right now, from the perspective since we rescinded the last rule, there is still like kind of a gray box around lots of these questions. And living in this regulatory gray zone that both not only impacts GPU and computing, but impacts a bunch of other industries, as and Derek was about to going to mention about the recent tariff announcement, right? It's like we're kind of living in this constant limbo of like what's allowed and not allowed. So much so that I hear rumors every other week about, well, now we're going to target an open source technology that was invented in America, and you're like, but that's an open source software. Like I can't control that, right? And again, extenuating beyond like what do we actually think we can accomplish, which is I'm a conservative. Like one of the point of being conservative is being not only a first principles type of thinker, but being a realist on the actual capabilities of America. When it comes to foundry regulations, which generally I'm in favor of, we have to realize that those countries aren't American. Like they may have an American presence, they may have American treasury accounts, but fundamentally they're Dutch and Japanese. And there's only so much you can squeeze out of that thing, as we're seeing with the tariff war or trade war, however you want to describe it. There's only so much we can actually do to push people to go do something we want them to do. And that we are a player. We're a quarter of the global GDP, basically. We have the ability to influence, but fundamentally what makes America strong and powerful is that we are a platform. We are a place where people put securities, put investments, put land, build companies, because the dollar, the treasury, our language, common law, everything we built is a platform which other people can build and trust into. And that is what's made us so successful since post-World War II, is that we believe that people can actually buy into this platform and choose to be part of the American ecosystem. And I think the same thing applies to computing, that we need to convince people either through the stick or through, hopefully, the means of the carrot, that they should choose to be part of the American ecosystem and not part of the Chinese ecosystem. So when you look at export controls, I would say it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. My goal as an American company and as a patriot is for as much of the global supply of GPUs to be American, and for them to adopt American platforms, and for that data to exist on American infrastructure, because I do not want that to be Chinese in any realm of possibility.
Well, Derek, let me turn to you. I think that the vision of America as a platform on which others can build is an appealing one in a lot of ways. How would you respond to what Aaron just laid out?
Did they sound reasonable? Because I really want to make them sound unreasonable, and then I think I might sound unreasonable. But that is the goal. I'm the convener. Chris is the host. I want to differentiate those two. I mean, for me, the big question. I'm a China expert. I agree with Aaron that the question of American goals is a serious one, but I don't know if I want to get into philosophy about America as a platform. It's a big question, and I have a more specific question, which is, has Chinese leverage, as demonstrated recently and very oddly loudly, I think because automakers have a lot of pull with this administration, through magnets, and President Trump's disinterest, which he made clear on several occasions, I think in the first term, has just ended the U.S. ability to do anything meaningful on export controls? And I think the answer is yes. And I'm hoping that there's some disagreement between us, but if not, I'll manufacture another disagreement, no problem. I don't think we've done very much to now at all, and yet we're paralyzed at this point. The Biden BIS had a congressional directive to start restricting foundational technology, and they just ignored it. They're just like, no, we're not doing that. Forget it. You were wrong to say that. We can just ignore you. I don't think, regardless of what you think the rules are, I don't think any firm has been punished sufficiently to deter them from circumventing or evading the rules. And without enforcement, the rules don't matter. We're arguing over something like, well, let's pretend this is the rule. Let's pretend this other thing is the rule. But there's no punishment. I mean, certainly there's no public punishment. Remember, the scale here is not Israel. Oh, you shouldn't have cooperated with the Israelis, and we can deter you because you made $50 million. The scale is China. You need a very serious deterrent to stop companies from evading controls on China. I don't think we've ever taken one. I'm going to cite a company here, which I think is fair, because I invited them to participate, and they ended up declining, but I gave them a chance, which is NVIDIA. I see them as an example, and because they're so big, the most prominent example of firms that have worked very hard to circumvent and evade controls and have faced no consequences. And I mean, at that point, I don't think export controls are interesting anymore. And that's what I'm trying to say as a something controversial that we can talk about. I see two lines of disagreement with this. First, we're just doing better than I say. The export controls are more effective. I think David started off in that direction. I want to put words in his mouth. And my answer to that is, I think the 232s with chips being maybe first in line will determine this. If you have 232s, that's Section 232 of the trade law. It's in a sector-specific restriction instead of a country-specific restriction. If you have Section 232s with a president who applies tariffs for absurd reasons, which happened yesterday, in case you're wondering if it hasn't happened recently, you can't get export controls. Right, so we're either going to get serious 232s or export controls, in my mind, have been tossed aside. Because if you can't get 232s, you're not going to get export controls because the president doesn't like export controls. He likes more exports. It's imports he wants to block. And I have a follow-up at some point when Chris thinks it's appropriate for David on this. I think the second attack is a standard industry attack. It may not. I don't think it's Aaron's attack, but a standard industry attack, which is how we're doing on export controls isn't the important thing. It's that export controls are just a bad idea, right? This is bad. It's bad for America, bad to restrict our business, bad to restrict, and there are all sorts of reasons I'm not going to go through because I think they're poor reasons. I mean, I think where I would go with that is for about 15 years, I've heard various industries, not just what we're talking about now, which is advanced computation or whatever, say China's about to catch us in their capability, so us self-restricting or you taking policy action has no value. And it's usually been dubious, and now I think it's just outright dishonest. And the reason I think it's become dishonest is if Xi Jinping's China has anything close to US capabilities, they're not going to buy our products. It's explicit. He says it over and over again in various ways. He doesn't say, I'm not going to buy American products, but he does talk about reducing China's dependence on the world in specific contexts. So what you're doing at that point is you're either helping them because they don't have the capability, or you're just milking your last couple of years. And that's actually what car companies did. In this room, or not in this room, in that room over there, pretty openly admitting that's what they were doing. We'll get a couple more years of profits. That's not an argument that I think stands up to the national interest in any respect. And so when industry makes it, I think they should be disregarded. Bloomberg on Tuesday had an article which was interesting, not entirely accurate in my opinion, but quite interesting, saying that China is looking for chips with high capabilities, such as those chips currently produced by NVIDIA, which means they don't have them. And that's the key thing. You're helping the Chinese technologically. Yes, they'll get them eventually, but we shouldn't be helping the Chinese technologically in the national interest, in my view. And we had a lot of excuses from industry on this that turn out to be inaccurate. I have a follow-up question for Aaron on this, although I'm not sure what his view will be. Two closing remarks. This is not just computational tech. Chris is, a semiconductor industry expert. If you haven't read Chip Wars, I find it depressing. Other people find it entertaining, informative, and so on. I suggest that you do read it. AI, obviously an element of computational tech, that's why Aaron's here. But legacy pharma, we already went through this. The Chinese couldn't make legacy pharma drugs, the simple drugs, and then they could. And now they control multiple product markets within pharmaceuticals, and they control the chemical production for a bunch of other product markets. So people say, we import our pharmaceuticals primarily from Ireland. Ireland gets the fine chemicals from China. Right? So legacy pharma was like, oh, whatever, we've lost it. Now we have high-end pharma moving much, much closer to China dependence. And the industry response is, oh, it's the best thing for us is to cooperate with China. All right, you're walking to the cemetery. Right? Some of these drug companies that you see, major American drug companies, are going to die, just like some American computing companies are going to die. And not because of the natural outcomes of things, because they cooperated with a predatory state. Economically predatory. And the last thing, and sorry this took so long, and this is probably the most controversial, the last reason I don't think we're going to take action, besides the fact that we haven't, besides the fact that there's industry opposition, is that I think President Trump is effectively very pro-China. I don't mean he sits there and thinks, how can I be pro-China today? I mean, in his actions, he's very pro-China. He is setting up a big business trip to China like it's 2011. He wants a TikTok deal when the law says TikTok should have been wound up a long time ago, and he keeps postponing it to make a deal, giving China leverage. The tariffs, since the climb down with China, since we both raised tariffs, we both lowered tariffs, the tariffs that have been imposed since then make China more competitive. That's what they do. He is in the process of making China a more competitive player in the American market around the world. The farmland ban yesterday, the Chinese don't invest in U.S. farmland. That's an issue from his first administration. This is just pretend. And so, a controversial reason export controls aren't going to work, aren't going to be meaningful. President Trump doesn't like them. A longer reason, we haven't, in my opinion, haven't been effective for a long time. And then a third reason is that industry opposition, I think, has been effective, even though I find it disingenuous.
A lot to pick up on there. Let me start with the question of industry. So I think there were two topics I'd like to dig into. One was, what's the responsibility of industry? Derek, you suggested that some companies were walking all the way up to the line or maybe even over the line. Shouldn't we want companies to walk all the way up to the legal limit and not over it, but up to it? Isn't that what companies are supposed to do, sell everything they can sell except crossing over the line? Or should we impose a higher standard and say there are some things that are legal to sell, but nevertheless should not be sold for reasons of patriotism or national security? How do we think about that question?
Can I answer first, and then, because it'll set up Aaron, because I think we're going to have a different view on this. But, so I would say quickly, the problem with walking up to, so the first problem is one we agree on, which is US policy is unclear. I took those shots at President Trump for a reason, because I think he's the primary reason US policy is unclear. The buck's supposed to stop there. So I agree that industry is in a bad position when US policy is unclear, and I sympathize with them there. But I think the line, I think you're missing a step before we set a line, which is intense industry lobbying about where the line is set in the first place, and then infringement on it. So not you, but I'd like to hear your thoughts about this. Industry did not want the strong AI diffusion rule under the Biden administration. It also doesn't want chip geolocation. It seems to only want restrictions that don't matter to business. And when you fight for that and fight for that and fight for that, and then a line is set as a result of your lobbying, and then you're like, well, we only went a little bit over the line. That's the disingenuousness that I'm talking about. If part of this is the US government's fault, and I guess, I try to influence the US government, I'll say a little tiny part of it is my fault. We're not setting good policy. Some of us here are policymakers, or attempting to be policymakers in an informal way. That's part of it. But industry is fighting against any meaningful restriction, and then when the restrictions are set, sometimes poorly, then they step up to the line. Then they step a little bit over the line. And I'm really curious as to your view.
I think that one, we should containerize and be specific outside of companies are unpatriotic, because I think one is that it is the interest of companies to lobby for what they think is interesting, right? I mean, literally, the Supreme Court says that companies are individuals, right? They have the right for free speech. They have the right to push forward their own agenda, to make profits, to deliver shareholders, and probably everyone in this room is some reflection of some shareholder in some way. And I mean, literally, this is AEI, right? So I think that when it comes to the specifics related to the grayness of the law, I think when it comes to the Biden one, which was the one that everyone was kind of really bemoaning and not understanding these different levels of certifications and tiers and things like that, and that it was impacting people that we sell significant, very significant levels of military equipment to, they're part of the whole American ecosystem of basically military dominance like Israel. And nobody understood, and then you ask people, it's basically protectionism, that they're executing protectionism against American companies by doing these kind of various roles. So I think when the line is not, when it's kind of veiled underneath this China kind of American pro-West, which I literally am super pro-West, but then it's targeting people who are pro-West that no one really knows why it is, but we just sort of assume it, the Biden rule, is what then doesn't give much credibility to the rest of the industry about what are we trying to do here, as well as commingling, even for example, what do you think about rules related to LLMs and how that should actually impact infrastructure companies. So even from not understanding of so you want me to violate 30 years of public cloud security for your rule. And there's so many kind of assumptions built into what you think LLMs can do, what you think they're going to be, how they're even the California one that was up for consideration that Kevin didn't sign. Considering that parameters that they were considering is now totally blown out of the water. Meta's so way beyond that, and now even open source models are reaching that. And so it's we're regulating something before we even know what it is, and as well as people who are pro, let's say LLM level of regulation. There's so many anthropomorphic assumptions that they're putting into is what do you think about humanity? What do you think humanity is going to be? What do you think work is? And they don't ever talk about that. And so they talk about Terminator, Matrix. Oh my God, the world's going to end. Mm-hmm. And it's we should probably unpack your presupposition, your priors into what you think LLMs are, what AI is going to be. Personally, I think I'm not an AGI ASI believer. I'm just not. I believe that does not mean that AI is not innately valuable. It clearly is. I think most of that's marketing. And if you dig into people who actually do believe that thesis, which by the way is unmeasurable, there's no way scientifically to measure that claim. You dig into it and you see that oh wait, you think humans are just reductionistic. You just think we're just numbers. You think we're just computers. Or you think, and you see actually, because it's built in all those priors, right? And so I don't think we should be regulating based on those priors, especially for an unmeasurable thing we don't even understand. But when it comes to things I would say I am in favor of, I think this is what Derek was mentioning, which is the sheer production capacity are things that I'm interested in. And so that would be basically foundry level type of regulations, which do appear quite effective. Now, when we hear that SMIC has a possible 5 nanometer process or lower, we shouldn't be surprised. Math is not Western. Math is ubiquitous, it's universal, and Chinese are very good at math. And so we shouldn't assume that it's just going to stop in perpetuity. And we should assume that China is going to China. China's a quite known quantity. This is where I agree. China does what China does. You telling me they took our technology, made it cheap, reproduced it, is now selling it to everyone in the world? Sounds like Temu, sounds like Shein, sounds like ZTE, that sounds like Comac, that sounds like everything else they do. So the real question is what do we do, right? And I think that the difference level of policy recommendations would be removing the LLM side, which I think conflates into semis, which I don't think, because those companies, one, they're separate companies. NVIDIA makes LLMs for fun, right? OpenAI makes LLMs as a business. And we're commingling the regulations between people who actually don't have exposure to that. So I think that should be clear. So just removing the AI kind of LLM side and just focusing on chips, which is what I deal with in terms of business side. I think that there then goes into the question of how far do you think we actually can delay? What Derek was mentioning, what's the meaningful level as a U.S. government we actually can extend out the arm to do something about it? And what is the ultimate envision we think the world should be? And my default is the more of the platform angle, the more of the Western ecosystem that we want to be the default ecosystem for all of Europe, all of this hemisphere. I've been writing about this thing called the new Monroe Doctrine of AI, essentially that we own this hemisphere. And basically picking areas and zones that we can extend our hand out very far, but then realize for areas that we can't, for countries that just don't really, that we get along with, but they're, let's say Vietnam, get along with them, but they're not, they're kind of pro-West, they're kind of probably going to be some a Singapore in the future. So it's we can engage them. So what do you do with people like that? The arm that we can extend out can only go so far. And I think that's where we have to be much more realistic about what we can actually accomplish and what we can't. But I think when it comes to let's say particular regions that we know we can be maximally influential, like Europe and say this hemisphere, I think we should have a very strong approach to that. That if you, just like we have the Monroe Doctrine when it comes to, we used to be very absolute about the bases. Now we know it depends on what Venezuela wants to do on any given day. But we would say stuff like that. I think that's when we can express our leadership in the world and press into countries on this side of the world because we dominate this side of the world. But then when it comes to places like Vietnam and Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand, all of the Gulf region, most of Africa, we have to be realistic. Wait, there's only so much we actually can do. And that's where America as a platform can come into an accelerate angle against Huawei, where we use the benefits of the market in our favor, which we are very good at. I just don't this is where I do agree with Derek that from a regulatory perspective, America is a great antagonist, not a great protagonist. It's not a good first punch. We're an excellent second punch. If you hit us, we're gonna freaking hit you back really hard. But when it comes to this kind of we're gonna be ahead of it, just historically, and this is not me being a determinist here, but we just don't do a good job. We kind of infight and get lazy and get fat, and then finally we get to the gym and we're okay, now we have to fight back.
I haven't gotten to that part of the getting to the gym yet.
No, I agree. I agree. So we haven't gotten that, because it's going to happen. Someone is going to do. I fully believe, because I believe in the fallen nature of man. Someone's going to do something really bad with this. Now, whether or not we can stop it or not, we can't, because it's human nature. That's when we respond, and then we figure out what to do. Right now, we're kind of playing games and kind of messing around with crap, and not being fully serious about it. But I do think that based on the power trajectory, Huawei's internal capabilities, the fact that half of all, according to Jensen, half of all AI researchers are Chinese, they have lots of things that we can't control that they're going to be very good at, and we should just assume that they're going to hit us with something. And I'd rather be in a position to where we have the dominant platform on this continent, the one south of us and the one across the Atlantic, than being we're only here, like we're only in America. That puts us in a significantly weaker position because I assume that China is strong. I assume that they have capabilities that we will never be very good at, and they will do something to us. So I'd rather be in a position of being dominant, at least in 2 continents, rather, or at least 4, including Australia.
Well, I'd love to, over the course of our conversation, break down the foundry level, the chip level, the data center level, the model level in a bit more detail. Maybe, David, do you want to jump in on the question of what is the responsibility of companies? Is it to maximize profits by selling everything legally possible, or is Derek right to suggest that if you're involved in the lobbying process, you should have more deference to where the line is actually?
I just want to, for years, companies told us pass a law and we'll respect it. And now they're telling us that's a bad law. And I actually agree a lot of times it's a bad law. But I just, being the oldest person on the stage, we have seen a shift in corporate behavior that it's difficult to find credible. Sorry, David.
I think that companies obviously have their legal fiduciary obligations to maximize shareholder returns. They also have obligations to the country and to their communities, and I think those are extremely important, and we've had some progress in recent years in, I think, having more recognition of that on the part of a range of companies in the U.S., especially with respect to kind of our strategic competition with China. I also think it's the obligation of the U.S. government to get policy right. And the U.S. government has the ability, obviously, both to set clear boundaries and to enforce them, and by doing so, to hope, perhaps, that those policy moves kind of cast a shadow that extends beyond the boundaries themselves and can play a deterrent role in deterring industry behavior that is not covered by the clear boundary. But I think the empirical record, certainly of, say, some 10 years of beginning to experiment with this with respect to China and technology and trade controls, is that we shouldn't expect that shadow to be particularly large or lasting. And so until and unless the US government using export control authorities, if those are relevant, or outbound investment restriction authorities, if those are relevant, which we've only just begun to innovate and kind of experiment with in recent months, unless those are drawn clearly and effectively, I think we will fail. The blame for the failure will be shared across the government, policymakers, and industry. But I think primarily with this issue set, it's up to the U.S. government to get it right primarily, and to force industry to comply with rules that it can understand.
And do you think it's responsible policymaking to draw a line but hope that the shadow is impacting behavior as well? Or I could imagine someone saying, that's a pretty vague policy, just draw a line and stick to the line.
No, sure. I think that the shadow is a kind of natural phenomenon. It's just not the strongest natural phenomenon, and shouldn't be the essence of our hope for getting the approach to China right. So when, for example, the Biden administration rolled out initial rules on outbound investment restrictions into China, affecting kind of a combination of corporate, private equity, and venture capital investment into certain parts of China's advanced AI, advanced semiconductors, and quantum sectors. This was done in a fairly slow process. It was sort of teased and previewed for years in the Biden administration. The final rule, I think, finally emerged in the autumn of 2024. It took effect in January of this year. The second Trump administration inherited it on the way in, and it is now technically, the regulatory rules of the land. But firstly, although it's not our main purpose, I guess, in the discussion today, those rules are fairly narrowly drawn, and I think we have a challenge in having the most sophisticated American investors supporting some of the most sophisticated and advanced Chinese technology development that extends far beyond those 3 initial sectors. And it extends to areas like biotech that have been mentioned. Now, does the rule in its early innings kind of cast a shadow over sectors that are beyond the 3? Yes, probably. But it's a diminishing shadow, and no one should rely on it.
Second question on companies' behavior. Derek illustrated a sort of race to the bottom, if you will, whereby companies will make decisions that are long-term detrimental to their position in the Chinese market, but short-term beneficial, and they can't not make that decision because if they don't, their competitors will. And so you've got companies racing to license their technology because they know they'll be outcompeted by other U.S. firms that are trying to do the same thing. Is that something that is just inevitable? That's companies competing in the context of a Chinese market where the Chinese government's going to push companies to do that? Or is that also a rationale for export controls that you're actually preventing companies from taking steps that are actually not in their, or at least their sector's own long-term interest?
Oh, I think that is certainly not inevitable. It shouldn't be considered inevitable. It might be inevitable in the absence of better U.S. government policy. But trying to help sectors that have not yet been fatally subverted by Beijing avoid that fate if their kind of pure, say public market incentives might drive them that way in the absence of export controls is one of the main objectives of export controls. And we should recognize in any discussion of what export controls should seek to do and how it should seek to do it, the sad record of a lot of, whether it's in aerospace or in civil nuclear technology or in automotive or in solar or in wind or in, aspects of semiconductors and many other areas where in the absence of export controls or in only the smallest, most limited exertion of export controls, U.S. companies pursuing what they thought was their interest and their obligation got themselves in catastrophic straits in China that have been bad for them commercially and very bad for us as a matter of national security policy.
Aaron, Derek, do you want to pick up on that?
So, I mean, the question about, I guess, I really want to ask David a follow-up question, but I guess the thought about this is it's just companies in the long term. So you're a CEO of a company, and let's say 15 years from now, the company still exists and you're not the CEO anymore. Should I blame that CEO for something I didn't like that you did? Right? That doesn't seem fair. But the history of U.S. lobbying, U.S. business lobbying on China is atrociously dishonest. And so it's very hard for me to say, oh, you're just doing what, your shareholders require. Like, you have a history in front of you. You have stated Chinese objectives to become less dependent on the world, meaning your products. And you're chasing, what, next year's quarterly statements? Your stock dividend? What? At some point, now I used to be a consultant who advised U.S. firms doing business with China. Yes, I am part of the problem. I helped start all this in my little tiny way in the 90s, took away American jobs, et cetera. But at some point you turn to industry and say, this isn't stupidity anymore. This is pernicious. You're not being tricked. You're not saying, oh, I think we, not every other company that tried this before, but we will be able to have a great long-term relationship with China. I can't wait to see what happens to Tesla now, for example. So I think at some point I would say, again, I wouldn't pick a particular CEO at any particular time. But the US government has to recognize industry's track record on China is horrible. And if we keep listening to them, our track record will be horrible. And so we're going to have to say there are costs. No, we're going to make this apply to all US firms, and I understand your point. We're going to make it apply to as many foreign firms as we can. We can make the Japanese and the Dutch stop if you're just talking about semiconductor equipment. It's harder to make them stop if you're going to put on a 30% tariff on Japan, who's maybe our closest ally in the world, for no good reason, but we can do it. So I think the US government has every reason to be more aggressive. And I think part of the fault we're not more aggressive is certainly the government itself. I wanted to just, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just want to ask you a quick question. Do you think the Trump administration is heading towards more effective export controls? We're 6 months in. Not, things change on a daily basis, but just taking a shot at it right now.
I think it might be. I certainly hope so. I think that, look, we have a fairly substantial empirical record here when it comes to the president and others. The first Trump term saw, in many ways, revolutionary and positive changes in the U.S. export control thinking and policy toward China, with respect to Huawei in general, although we can get into the major shortcomings of that kind of, Huawei and SMIC and associated regime in terms of loopholes on those controls. But in many ways, you also had probably the most effective control to date were the first Trump administration's controls on Dutch EUV transfers to China, which were correct in identifying a crucial choke point in China's technology ambitions that was, enormously, just about exclusively in the hands of a very close ally. It was identified before it was, before the horse had left the barn, as it were. And the controls were broad, fairly harsh, and simple. They were countrywide. This thing cannot be transferred to China, period. That was effective in itself, and I think should serve as a model for export control thinking and design going forward. Most of that happened at toward the end of the first Trump administration, and certainly it happened in an environment where I think, Derek, you alluded to this, the president's own favorite policy tool is not the export control. Right? It is the tariff. He says he is tariff man. It's his favorite word. I think he says tariff might be the best word in the English language other than love. And those are, those are important signals of the president's interest and of the potential policy course of any administration of his. But it's also the case that his first term had this record. His second term to date, I think I would quibble a bit, Derek, with the way that you've characterized it. I think there is an interesting mix that certainly holds out the prospect that we get significant, further positive development of export control policy on China and about China out of the administration. You had certain signals out of the second Trump administration on its first day. So, for example, this America First trade policy memo that was put out addressed various things that would be expected in a statement of trade policy, but also various kind of policy regimes and goals that are quite new and novel and reflect, I think, good thinking out of the Trump administration, also out of the Biden administration, and out of the Congress over the last 10 years. It identified, other than the usual sort of trade instruments of statecraft, it mentioned outbound investment, which we've discussed. It mentioned the Commerce Department's so-called ICTS regime for essentially scrutinizing cross-border data flows and kind of the digital economy, and export controls, and said specifically, actually on all of those, that those areas should be reviewed by the new administration, not just in general, but specifically to see that they be strengthened and that they not be undermined by loopholes in implementation, which was especially a problem with export controls. You had statements of very significant interest in the use of export controls and the expansion of export control rules and the tightening of implementation by Howard Lutnick in his confirmation hearing, and in others in their confirmation hearings. Early on, you had in April, I guess it was, when it finally happened, you had the restriction by the Trump administration of the NVIDIA H20 chip, kind of crucial to inferencing and to advances out of China that we'd seen, like DeepSeek. You had in May something that I think has largely been overlooked, especially given its importance, and it's crucial, I think, to everything that we're discussing today, which was that the Trump administration Commerce Department put out a message saying that any Huawei Ascend AI chip that any country would seek to import from China anywhere around the world is subject to US export controls, because in the production of that Huawei Ascend chip is US technology that gives the US export control authorities the ability to control those chips. That was an extremely important statement of focus on encouraging the diffusion of US AI infrastructure around the world and getting in the way of China's ambitions to export their own AI infrastructure, including especially these Huawei Ascend chips. And that was done in May. It was partly overlooked because it was part of this kind of larger move which got more of the attention, which was to rescind the Biden diffusion rule. We can, I think, get into that in more detail as might be of interest. I would say that I think that the administration has said certain things about the Biden diffusion rule and about the kind of the issues of diffusion policy, but the key test is still very much ahead of us. It's in what the administration chooses to do in its replacement of the diffusion rule with revised rules of its own. And so, there's more that we might get into in terms of the way that export controls played into the trade war, the restrictions that the administration also put in place on things like, semiconductor EDA software and on chemicals and on airplane, engines and other components, which I think was actually, is perhaps best understood in the context of the trade war and the tit for tat and not in export control policy as such. I do think that just on that subject, a crucial piece that we might want to dig into is this question of how significant is the rare earths embargo that Beijing essentially imposed, and that brought the two sides to a version of a truce, first in Geneva and then in London. The question being, who really has escalation dominance in competitive export controls? I do think there is a danger that Washington and others get the impression that Beijing, as demonstrated with its rare earths move, has escalation dominance. I think that would be wrong, very damaging, and wrong, because the fact is there's an enormous amount of further escalation capability that the US has using export controls on all sorts of things that we export to China that are crucial to China in the long term and in the immediate term, that are completely unrestricted and uncontrolled, including in the semiconductor space and elsewhere. And so that is a key point. I think there is a risk that this idea that, that there's a spirit of Geneva or a spirit of London, and it should cause the US government to feel cowed from pursuing, various actions in the trade and technology space and elsewhere that it needs to pursue for its own national security interests vis-a-vis China. That would be, I think, an erroneous and really damaging takeaway. And I think we're at some risk of having it be the takeaway that some do take, but I don't think it's inevitable at all. And I think the administration has signaled in various ways that they might have, a lot kind of in the works that would represent important progress on these issues.
If I actually would take more of Derek's position, I think that you can take what you want from this White House of whatever views, and this is just me being objective, not having like a particular normative view of like having pro or less export controls, but just I think that tariff is the raison d'etre. It is the summum bonum of the administration, which means that if you're pro-tariff, you're pro-national champion, which means that you're not, export controls are just used in the context of a tariff war. It's not actually the goal. Like it's part of a broader kind of moving the chess pieces around rather than actually, well, we don't want GPUs in China. Like if there was a deal on the table that presented President Trump with more upside on other parts of U.S. industrial capacity, he would totally do it. Like because GPUs were so clearly in the dominant lead in terms of like AI infrastructure. It's like an easy thing to give up compared to the other things which I think he would just personally put higher on the list. Like I think broad semiconductor capacity he is very high on his list, but everything from like agricultural to like raw steel, like things like steel, like cars, buildings, right? That's you're talking about a president. I voted for him 3 times because I'm pro-Trump, but you're talking about a dude that built buildings and like made gold toilets. Like that's how he thinks about the world. So it's more like raw American industrial capacity than it is like NVIDIA, right? Like NVIDIA to him is just part of this thing he's drawing. And as well, the consequence of every tariff war, trade war, is promotion of national champions. Like that is the logic that happens afterwards. You punch other people down so that you would buy your stuff. And I think that from what I'm saying is that I would much rather us have a much more specific focus on basically a handful of companies that do something that only they do, like ASML. That when you're buying something from ASML, it's $200 million in size of half this room. Like that's something that is much more easily controllable, just like a Boeing asset. Like you literally have to fly from Seattle, right, outside of unless you're assembling in China. But generally speaking, it's to make a Boeing 737, it requires 200 to 300 companies that are built into that single platform that we deliver. So and again, you fly it, right, or you ship it on a boat. Like it's something that is much more easily controlled than something you get at Best Buy. And that's where like I would much rather, if we're going to take an approach of like how do we actually mitigate raw industrial capacity within China, and the rare earth things actually I do is actually interesting. I think it's mostly a bluff in other countries. We can do it with this hemisphere in Australia. We have plenty of capacity to do rare earths. But when it comes to like, if you're thinking about, okay, what is China really good at? How do we actually continue to maintain the lead? It is targeting things that is innate, basically sovereign capacity. And a GPU to me does not fit in that. Unless you wanted to talk about AI LLMs, right? But this is where the commingling happens, where you start targeting companies that exist in the supply chain that isn't at that thing. And if you want to actually target that thing, it's actually not through export controls. Like you may use that vehicle, but you're targeting companies that are actually kind of like unrelated to that. And it's like downstream and then causes all these like, you know, to use a Thomas Sowell phrase, like these negative secondary impacts. And as well as like, I'm actually generally pro foundry restrictions. We should not be surprised if they do it themselves. We should not be shocked. We should like, it's something that it's very logical for them to do. Like the whole posture of every Belt and Road initiative that Xi has ever gone down is to create stability for the party. So he will continue to do that. And so when we think about like what are we actually trying to accomplish, to me it's like we got to help all of our allies win, which just goes back to the platform idea. But then target things we actually can achieve. Like if we're going to sell a semiconductor piece of manufacturing equipment that costs $250 million, I think that's relatively straightforward. Like versus again something you can buy at Best Buy, and that's more the differentiation is like what is actually fully achievable, and something that is clean, as you said. Like, but you can see from the greatest expression, at least when it comes to GPU export control of like the Biden rule. It was like chaos. The whole thing was chaos. Like like no one even really knew what was happening, and then semiconductor manufacturers ignored it, thought it was like under Trump, and then when Trump signaled that he wasn't necessarily going to do something about it, then it was like a full court press to like actually change the rules. But like it was vastly confusing because you're trying to control something in which no one party actually is fully in control of over, but then we're going to hold people responsible to, but then they want to deflect that responsibility outwards. And in the ecosystem of semiconductor supply chains and like buying and moving and brokering all those things is an industry that pre-exists GPUs. With trillions of dollars in transactions, and so that's why the rule was so chaotic. It was like you're trying to control an industry that was not under any regime before, and you're trying to push responsibility to people who actually were not really responsible for something, versus like the foundry stuff is actually relatively clean, right? It's like, oh, there's like 3 companies generally, and we know where it goes. We can obviously see it. It's a super expensive piece of equipment. That's like to me when thinking about like how do we think about how do we win China from and preventing them from having some of these like types of things in capacity. It's like that's the type of stuff I'm more interested in targeting than like a 5090 that I put in my desktop computer.
Well, let me dig into that a bit more, and I'd like to grab some questions from the audience in a couple of minutes. But it seems to me that from a sort of theoretical perspective, there's broad agreement that you should only control things that you've got a monopoly in or you and your friends have a monopoly in, and if China can do it too, then control doesn't make sense. I think there's broad agreement on that. I think there's also broad agreement that if China can't do it now but can do it in 1 month's time, that's probably not going to be a very effective control. And so the disagreement largely seems to be how long will it take China to replicate what we can do? And so when it comes to chip making equipment, if you listen to the CEOs, they say, well, we've got a 5 or 10 year lead, and so the US government has been pretty expansive, or relatively expansive in that space. When it comes to GPUs, there's some domestic production in China, and so you get conflicting signals to some degree about how far ahead NVIDIA or AMD are of their Chinese competitors. And when you get to the models themselves, it's even less clear. There's different benchmarks, they change all the time. It's less obvious what you're trying to measure there. We'd love to hear from all 3 of you how you think about the empirics of where we are actually on those 3 different levels of chip making tools, of chips themselves, and of models, and what does that tell you about the proper posture towards export controls? Do you want to start, Aaron? Or?
I'll start, I guess. I mean, Aaron should know more about this than me. Or if not, then I should run his company, whichever. I don't, the way there's a problem here of to start with, which is, are we trying to compete with the Chinese commercially, internationally, or are we trying to have the most advanced technology? And it's weird in chips because the most advanced technology would seem to be like, they'll have some strategic advantage over us, but of course our military doesn't use the most advanced technology chips by and large. So it's not as clear as it seems. I am not trying to compete with China commercially, internationally, because I assume that even if they're 2 years behind us, 3 years behind us, 4 years behind us, they will sell a much cheaper product. and our product will not be affordable in a large portion of the world, which might get back in, it might, I don't know if I would include South America and where we should try to, have our tech block. I know that's not your term, but I'm not trying to compete with China commercially. I am trying to reduce their capability expansion. And so, if you're trying to compete with China commercially, you have a different set of goals, and I understand why industry has that. That's not what I think the US government should be doing. So when I assess this, I don't assess it as like, well, is China 2 years away from us to being able to compete commercially with us? Because they probably are in all these things. They can just put up a cheaper version. And maybe they'll catch up with us technologically faster or not, but it doesn't matter. That's not my goal. I think a 2-year US advantage, because I'm not trying to sell stuff, is important and worth defending. I think this is my sense of AI, and I agree there are tons of benchmarks, there are tons of different goals. It's very difficult to do. I did sorry to use this language, a deep dive on DeepSeek, and I find the company itself really unimpressive. Like, it looks like a fraudulent Chinese company that has one breakthrough that it got from other companies, and it cannot go forward in the way that it's a truly innovative company. That may be wrong, and I don't understand the technology very well, but that's an example. We have seen the Chinese struggle tremendously with chips. In other words, they're wasting a huge amount of money. Now, at the outcome, if you see China going, if you're a commercial competitor, maybe you don't care about all the money they're wasting because they're going to continue wasting it. As you said, this is what China does. And like, you're still faced with a chip that's 90% as good as yours and half the price. And the fact that they wasted a ton of money to get there doesn't help you. But from America's standpoint, it does. I want them to have a difficult a time developing their plane as we can get, right? Because they're a rival of us. I don't want to go to war with them. I don't want to sanction all their companies into oblivion, but I don't want to help them. And so from my perspective, I see reasons for export controls in all of these areas because I'm not trying to keep China from having a commercially, globally competitive product. That's a goal I don't think we can achieve for very long, if we can achieve it at all right now. And I see our advantages. I see our advantage in chips as being very significant. I see our advantage in equipment as being very significant. And as we move to AI, where there are more goals and I have less knowledge, I'm still distrustful. Like, if you read the Chinese about DeepSeek, it's like a national patriotic duty to talk about how great this is. But when they get into what the capabilities are, they're not Meta, and I'm not a big Meta fan. So I think in AI, but I'm not, I defer. That's why I said I wanted to go first so you could fix everything I said. But I think in all three areas there are reasons to do this. If you start doing this on commercial advantage, that isn't true. Then that's a different perspective. But if you start doing it as I want the Chinese to have as difficult a time as possible to move up, spend as much of their resources, not trying to destroy them or anything like that, but it's hard for them, then I think we have reasons to restrict in all three.
Yeah, so I would agree with a lot of that it really comes down to, and I talked to the people who did the Biden rule after they left and debated one of them, and he literally agreed with me that my view is that basically under a year. And he said if he didn't, he's like 4 or 5 years.
What's under a year be?
In terms of being, let's say, relatively equivalent.
Okay, got it.
Right? And there's different, as he was saying, different ways of measuring that. You can do it commercially, you can do it technology, from a technological perspective. I had it under a year, and he goes, oh, if I had it under a year, I would totally take your view. Right? And so it really is, like you said, exactly how far, where do you think it is? And so from taking those three things, I would say from a foundry perspective, I mean, from a sheer technology perspective, like, we're still crushing it, right? And they could barely do a 5 nanometer process. Currently, everything's on 7.
Taiwan is still crushing it.
Yeah, I know. That's a good point. I was about to say that.
Our designs.
Yeah. So and that's what's running into, at least when it comes to Cloud Matrix, Huawei's like a GB alternative. That's why they're having a lot of heat issues with it, is because it's on 7 rather than 4. And so that's meaningful, right? But then you get into, as Derek was saying, commercialization. That's something that we think everything should be measured on the spectrum of, like, it's the best. Well, in China, it's like, that's not what they're doing, right? They're trying to build a platform, trying to build an ecosystem. That's why they talk about how many people are using Huawei's developer ecosystem. That's why they talk about delivering GPUs as a means of basically a Belt and Road initiative. It comes with people, it comes with engineers. And this is where we as Americans have to realize that they're not competing on the same wavelength. Like, they believe they're shooting for an ecosystem. So why are they dominating open source? China doesn't give two craps about open source. Clearly, they literally invented the Great Wall of China, around the internet, is because it's counter to us. They're trying to take money from us, right? And this is where I think this is where I am, is that's why we have to focus on basically out accelerating, like winning the race by creating the dominant platform in which everyone buys. That is the ultimate way that because that's the game that they're playing. That's the game we need to focus on playing. From semiconductor, hundreds of thousands, maybe possibly millions if they get customers like SMIC and some of that range. Like it's somewhere in that. We don't have full kind of visibility into it, but SMIC clearly has making plenty of money and they continue to grow. In terms of like the GPU level, I would say they're playing, again, a different game from a technology perspective. NVIDIA is absolutely crushing it, even against his second cousin Lisa, absolutely crushing it. Because he is the Ferrari, he is the Porsche, he is dominating. So Jensen is king there, and he will remain the king by, I think, to the end of the decade at least. But the way that Huawei is countering that is that they're not trying to compete against that. They're trying to compete at the network level, they're trying to compete at the cost level, because the world is not power constrained. The world is silicon constrained, and Huawei knows that, and so they're leaning into that. And there could be two things. My father is a Chinese exile, so he fled communism, and like there are the way that when I was raised, I was raised traditional Chinese. I played violin more than I ever wanted to, and he said I had to be a doctor, right? And so he still doesn't even know what I do. He's like, you're not a doctor, you're a disappointment, right? So and like, what do you?
This is being videotaped, by the way.
I know he'll hear it. He'd be like, I agree. He's like, I still don't know what you do. So but one of the things that I think you have to walk away with the Chinese thought is like it's a both and question. And I love thinking about the different points of technological achievement that China basically, you could say, gained or stole. And it was always through this like very asymmetric, almost creative way of taking technology from people. And I love the story about how they got like nuclear weapons, because Stalin was like, you're freaking crazy. I'm not giving you any type of nuclear weapons. So what they did is they invented this whole narrative around like Eisenhower could use the nuke against us. And then he basically went back to Stalin and basically was like, hey, look, you do want Americans on your border? And he goes, all right, well, I'll just send some Soviet engineers, but like just don't take it. And then 5 years later, they got it, right? And so like, but that was all done through this like created this moment in narrative for Eisenhower to say this. Same way they got like 5th gen technology, same way they got submarines, same way they got much of their missile technology, much of their technology around tanks. So we look at the history and you're like, okay, so then how do we compete against something that's their strength? We do what America does best, which is like you be the platform. You're the dominant platform. And I wish America would embrace much more of the open source perspective, because that's what's going to win AI. It's going to be a myriad of models. OpenAI is a model company, but it's a consumer brand predominantly. And clearly, because Anthropic has the best models, my company uses mostly Anthropic models. It is the best, but it doesn't matter because they have brand. And so it's going to be a myriad of models world, and that world open source wins. And we are absolutely sucking right now at open source. Like China is crushing you go look at OpenRouter, which is one of the best measurements of this stuff. It's absolutely dominating, absolutely. And that's where we need to get more serious about contributing to the open source community and allowing people to adopt this technology. And I hope that NVIDIA would use some of that money to also invest more in open source as well, because that is how people are going to use this technology. People are going to have sovereign deployments. They're going to build their own sovereign-oriented LLMs. I don't really know if it even matters from a usage perspective. Like Switzerland just announced their LLM, all built internally. Go read the post. It's on LinkedIn, the person who built it. And like they talked about how it was done on their own cluster in Switzerland on Swiss, basically dialect, no commercialization, fully open source. And you're like, why would Switzerland need to do that? Because a lot of this stuff kind of lends itself to mutually assured destruction frameworks of like, well, I need that, and if I need that, then that person may have something against me, so I'm going to do it. And one of my investors, who's a trader, he's in New York, and he told me that he was deploying LLMs in across his firm, and I asked him why he did it, and he goes, well, I heard that my competitor was doing it, so I just started doing it. So it's like Axelrod billionaire sort of framework. Like if that guy has an advantage, I'm going to take that advantage. And this is where America can be so successful, It's like, how do we take advantage of the fact of that this is the innate fear and also opportunity we have in front of us? How do we accelerate to where Huawei is behind? They are trying to super behind on inferencing infrastructure. They're very, very far behind. Training infrastructure, it's debatable, but inferencing infrastructure, very, very far behind. You can go see this in terms of DeepSeek, go to their website, try to use their product, super slow, right? But then go use it on any like open router sort of hosting product, super fast. It's because they're using all their infrastructure for training. And so we have the advantage now to where like my biggest complaint about the last Biden rule is like we were hurting people who were selling F-35s to. It was just like, it was so insane that like, okay, so Portugal you can buy, well, they canceled their order, but they were buying 60-something F-35s, and we're like, but oh, no, you can't get Blackwells. That's too risky. You can't have that. Right? And that was my biggest complaint. Was like, do we want to win or do we just want to play defense the whole time? I'd rather play strategic defense. Things that we know China's good at. How do we hit at their ability to produce? How do we hit at their ability to proliferate Huawei? Love that stuff. Let's do more of that. But then when we go to Jensen and be like, no, right? And you're like, what do you mean? I'm literally trying to sell someone that you sold freaking interconnectable signals to.
But he's not just trying to do that. I mean, that's the point about the distrust of industry, right? I understand that, like, where did Portugal come from as a cutoff point, and it seems to be kind of arbitrary, and they could have been kept out or kept in or whatever, but some sort of consistent policy. But let's not, let U.S. industry, and I'm going to pick on NVIDIA, but you brought him up in this case. Like the main pitch is constantly going to China to sell more chips to China. So on that point, no, we don't let him do what he wants. And when he comes and tells us, hey, why don't you let me do business with Portugal? Because I don't trust you. And that's the part you're missing in the expansion. That the U.S. government has this problem of, I want to take advice from industry, but I don't trust industry. When the industry says like, well, we want to run faster, okay, fine, but you're helping China run faster. Again and again and again and again, not you.
I'm
not talking about your business.
No, I'm
just saying.
So
So it makes to get to a point of there is a coherence to this argument, even though the three of us have very different perspectives. The coherence to my part of the argument is you are exhibiting, in my opinion, exactly the attitude that makes it more difficult for the U.S. government to act. Because there is a disregard of industry's past and current practices towards China, while claiming the U.S. government doesn't understand the industrial situation, and which it doesn't, but it can't get good advice from industry because you are a conservative patriot. Other people are not acting that way with regard to the Chinese especially, and it's a big market, so that's why it's the Chinese especially. So it makes it very, very difficult when the government is slower on technology anyway for us to get our export control marks right, to be quick enough to be targeting the right technology and so on. And the industry complaints about this is like, are you still selling enormously to the Chinese? Are you still lobbying us about it, et cetera, et cetera? Then why would we listen to you about AI diffusion?
So on the diffusion question, I think there's the debate about what should be allowed to sell to China. There's a bit about Portugal, and I think Portugal's probably gotten a lot more coverage in this conversation thus far than
those beaches are super dangerous. You never know. Could be a Chinese person on that beach. You never know.
I think the Middle East is the interesting test case.
Right.
And that's where we've seen a real policy change in the prior administration and the current one. I'd love to dig into that, and I'm sensitive that we're getting close to the end, and I want to bring in some audience as well. But maybe, David, could I pose the Middle East question to you, where we've seen the administration, it appears, although we're still awaiting exact details, provide licenses for major volumes of GPU imports to the UAE. Is this wise? Is this dangerous? Help us understand the Middle East.
Yeah, I think it's a very useful question because there are those parts of the Biden diffusion rule that the second Trump administration inherited that are, I think, exactly as kind of as we've characterized in part. Why Portugal? Why Poland? Israel, India. I mean, there was a collection.
Austria.
There was a collection of very important American allies and partners who were put, in a broad tier alongside, let's just say, non-allies partners like Yemen, who also don't, play the role of a Poland or an Israel in, the international and kind of U.S. partner tech ecosystem. I think a certain amount of, if not ridicule, kind of an observation of arbitrariness is fair. I think that was clearly a peculiar part of the Biden rule, and frankly, it was a very big part of what the new Trump administration in its early weeks on tech issues dealt with diplomatically, because suddenly we had very reasonable concerns from Swiss friends and Polish friends and India and Israel and others about why they were getting this sort of second-class, broad brush treatment. And so they heard from the new Trump administration that the matter was under review, and obviously by May, the Biden rule broadly had been was jettisoned. But the question is really kind of on what grounds and what will it mean for the revisions going forward? And I think the distinction between the Middle East, I would add to that group Southeast Asia and India, and some of these other peculiar diplomatic cases that actually I think are edge cases when it comes to the rule and the significance of these questions about what national security safeguards to place around the export of large volumes of advanced compute to important partner countries around the world. And I think the essence of the rule had to do with certain China-related national security objectives and kind of advanced technology diffusion and proliferation objectives that are not necessarily a matter of enormous disagreement between the previous Biden administration and the current Trump administration. And so I think that the Trump administration is still working through, and we will see, we expect, policy announcements and diplomatic and deal announcements that deal with really important and complex questions around AI diffusion, including what volumes of advanced compute are going to be exported to third countries as individual countries and as a proportion of what is kept at home. So for example, the Biden administration had a 50% rule in their diffusion framework requiring US hyperscalers to keep at least 50% of their advanced compute at home and to build their most capable data centers first at home before overseas. And this had a quality of kind of, America first, domestic AI dominance, an attempt to prevent the offshoring of major advanced AI capabilities in the way that we had suffered from the offshoring of other technological capabilities, in years past. And I think aspects of that logic are likely to carry through into the Trump administration, although we'll have to see the details. And there are, I think, kind of interesting, points of contention potentially inside the administration. Similarly, the question of when advanced compute is authorized for export to the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, etc., are the chips sent only to US-run data centers in these third countries? Or are large volumes of the most advanced chips to be sent to also, national data center, providers and AI companies in these third countries? That is a very important question that has major consequences commercially and in national security terms in terms of protecting against technology transfer. And the Trump administration hasn't yet, I think, had the occasion to clarify how exactly that will play out in say, the Emirates and in Saudi Arabia. I think, we saw a lot of headlines that obviously talked about the export of chips in the case of the UAE to at least sort of commercial projects where G42 in the Emirati case was going to play a major role. In Saudi Arabia, likewise, Humane, the new Saudi state-backed AI platform, a bit analogous to G42. And yet, Secretary Lutnick gave congressional testimony about a month after the trip, where he appeared to say that actually there will be national security strictures on the export of these chips that keep them exclusively in the custody of US-run data centers in these third countries. That is an interesting contradiction, at least between headlines for what they're worth and the statement of a major policymaker on the issue. And I think the details are extremely important and are still to be clarified.
Let me get some questions from the audience, as you only got 13 minutes left. If you please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and make sure you ask a question rather than give a speech. That would be.
Yeah, that's for us. We give the speeches.
That would be fantastic. Question up in front, please.
Hello. Thank you very much. Murray from Johns Hopkins SAIS. I'm a student in International Finance Program. Maybe a question for Aaron and David. You talk about American platform. First, question for Aaron. What do you think would be the ideal relationship between that ideal platform, the ideal American platform, and China? For David, I saw there are actually news, Chinese researchers actually carrying USB sticks with them and flying to Singapore, flying to Indonesia, flying to Malaysia to get their data collected and train their models and bring these new models back to China. We just talked about the UAE deal with a bunch of advanced chips, from NVIDIA. How can we just make sure that they don't pack up their computing power and then sell it to China, help them to train the data and help them to have the advanced models? Are we just thinking about this whole, advanced technology in a very conventional way? Would the traditional export control be actually feasible with these actually new technologies?
Let's grab one more question if we can and package together.
Keep the answers quick.
In back, please.
Hey, thanks. Ryan Fidashik, longtime China tech analyst. Great presentation. Thanks. I think you hit all the major debates, but the big question missing, to my mind, is what are we doing with the time we're buying? Like, I love export controls. I sleep with an 800-page copy of the EAR under my pillow. Okay, it helps with my sleep posture.
I think we don't have to listen to him now.
What are we doing? To your mind, how are we going to spend the next few years of lead that we've bought under the previous several administrations?
Great. Let me turn that over to our panelists.
Okay, I'll take that one.
Sure.
You have the other. Whoever should go first.
So on, I think your question was like smuggling, and then the first one was related to
American platform.
Oh, American platform, yeah. How's it look in the world? Yeah. So I want American models, American chips on American-defined data centers, and I want that to be globally defined. And that doesn't mean that necessarily the title ownership is American. I think Letnick was referring to like the free trade thing that they were doing in that country, the free trade zone or something, that they're basically Saudi Arabia was going to build like a little area that was American jurisdiction. But I think that we as a country need to support other sovereign AI efforts, and we shouldn't have Switzerland brag that their LLM, their sovereign LLM was trained on non-NVIDIA products. That should be American. And so we have to understand that like the NVIDIA ecosystem is not just I open a machine and look at this cool motherboard. Like NVIDIA is software. It's a software hardware platform. It's Apple. So it's not just the thing. The reason why AMD is so far behind is the software stack. The reason why Huawei is so far behind is because of software stack. That is a combination of both those things together. So just because I send a PlayStation to somebody doesn't mean they know how to make a PlayStation, right? Because the PlayStation itself is powered by software of the game and the machine itself. And so when we're thinking about like controls, we should lean into like that's the advantage that NVIDIA has. And so how do we lean into that in terms of like doing these international deployments? But I want our stuff everywhere. And the second point about like then in terms of the data and smuggling question, I think one is that we have to take a step back and realize that 60-ish% of the data on the internet is American English. And then the next would be an extension of English, and then Spanish, and then Chinese. And so these countries that are doing LLMs, and going back to the KSA example, I remember meeting the ambassador staff under Biden and the ambassador staff under Trump when I was in KSA. And when I talked to them about under Biden, the whole conversation constantly was GPUs. And the staff was like, I can't freaking talk about GPUs anymore. Like, all they want to talk about is GPUs. Because they were, offended. They were like, why am I in the same category as Yemen, right? And there was like this true offense to it. And then you actually go into the details into like particularly KSA example, is like when they're thinking about doing their own localized LLM, all of that data is government data. Like their language in terms of the continuation of their language for Arabic, they're very proud of their language, is government documents, is judicial documents, it's legislative documents. And one, they have a data sovereignty law, there's around 27 in the world. And they're like, I am not giving that to anybody. Quick. Yeah, I'm not giving that to anybody. So I think we should accelerate America as a platform.
Follow up. America's a platform in Portugal we got, Middle East we got. America is a platform in China. Do we want our stuff in China so that China's on our platform?
Generally with I'm actually much okay with that with some other barriers around it, particularly targeted foundry stuff. But I would be more in favor of like cleaner rules, like maybe if you want a Rubin, you get a Rubin a year later. Something like that to me is easier to understand than like, oh, we're gonna play this chess game around the world. But generally, because NVIDIA is a software platform and a hardware platform, I'm generally kosher with it. But I would much be more interested in targeting foundry level capacity and Huawei itself rather than like NVIDIA.
David.
Yeah, look, I think that that good piece of Wall Street Journal reporting on, traveling with suitcases to places like Malaysia, I think speaks in part to the effectiveness of these controls. They clearly are a major factor for frontier AI development in China, and that has important, national security and commercial implications. I think that, again, among the elements of the diffusion issue that aren't Portugal and Poland, and in many ways are even more important, are the questions of kind of smuggling and diversion, which then lead to questions like, what about geolocation controls, hardware-enabled mechanisms on chip for that sort of assurance for governments, and then crucially remote access, and figuring out how to design restrictions on PRC entities being able to access remotely through the cloud all of the compute that we otherwise spent all this effort to restrict from flowing directly into China is a hugely important issue and a major challenge. How it aligns with years and decades of basic Western cloud encryption commercial core practices is a very hard question. But it's also part of what I think makes sort of this issue set, this sort of diffusion policy regime, to the extent it's a single thing, important and complex and still largely to be designed, apart from some of the more kind of immediate headline-making aspects of the diplomacy and the tiering and those things which were important, but at this point are, I think, we've transcended.
Derek?
So you're asking a very broad question, Ryan, and I want to be really quick so other people can ask questions. But I think I just disagree with what I think is your premise. What are we going to do? And I'll say it in the following way. We did not create this lead as U.S. government action. It was created by our private sector. U.S. government action, as I said at the beginning, has been, in my mind, ridiculously ineffective. David says we're working on outbound investment. That's true. I brought the topic up in 2017. We got little tiny restrictions at the end of 2024. That's not a pace that's going to help. It's the market. We are at the American Enterprise Institute, and I spent the whole event attacking industry, and I'm very happy about that. But the market is what gave us this lead, and what we're going to do with whatever lead we have is going to be determined by private firms. Now, the way I square the circle is the more we cut the Chinese out, the more space there is for American and friendly companies. Right? We do not have a properly functioning world market in a lot of industries because it is incredibly distorted by China. And so I would like to see us identifying what we think the crucial, I would actually start with pharma rather than advanced computing, not that this hasn't been an educational discussion. If you cut the Chinese out, what we will do with that lead is we would build up our capabilities just by market operations, not by US government commands of this is the important thing and what we're going to support. And are there costs to cutting the Chinese out? Yes, there are absolutely costs at a corporate level to cutting the Chinese out, and they are significant. At the national level, I think there are obvious large gains. And I would just point out that in the 1990s, we didn't need the Chinese for a big tech revolution, and we had a balanced budget and higher labor force participation. And so it's not like, oh, we can't possibly exist without Chinese engineers. We can, and that would be what we would do with the time. We would actually improve American industrial competitiveness in an undistorted market.
And I'm with Derek on pharma for what it's worth. We can make that a next event. on AI, especially kind of on the theme that Derek pointed to of frankly problems of U.S. policymaking, I'd point to power, energy, permitting. If that is not fixed dramatically, then that, I think, is a key metric for whether we take advantage of the lead that we do get through these more defensive measures. It could be the limiting factor, and it's a major advantage that China has. It's also a major advantage of why places like the Gulf are so important for AI investment. It's very natural for companies that want enormous volumes of compute that require enormous amounts of power to go to places where they can get it. This should be one of them more than it is.
Let's grab a very quick final round of questions, then turn it to our panelists for any wrap-up remarks. Any other questions?
We've lost.
All right, we've settled the debate. Settled the debate. Excellent. Well, in that case, why don't I thank my three panelists for this enlightening conversation, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.